All right. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here today and talk about error analysis in reading. Um, as Zach said, my name is Jessica Toste. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Special Education at UT Austin, and we will get us started. So we don't have a huge amount of time together, but I'm going to try to talk about as much as possible to get through kind of the basics of what you need to know around error analysis. So I'll start just kind of setting a framing around data-based individualization and the primary sources of data that we use to engage in the process of DBI. Then I'll talk about what we're here for today, error analysis. So what is error analysis and why would we use error analysis in reading? And most of our time, we're going to go through kind of four steps that I've outlined to conduct an error analysis using students' reading assessment data. And in those four steps, we'll kind of talk briefly about all the different things you need to do to get to the point of doing an error analysis, and then go through some more extensive examples of how you would actually conduct that and then attach it to your instruction. We'll end off with I'll share a couple of resources, and then I'll throw it back to my NCII colleagues to share some additional resources that they have available. So first, what is DBI or data-based individualization? Probably if you were on the NCII listserv already or saw this webinar, you've heard DBI. It is a systematic process of ongoing data collection and using that student data to determine when and how to intensify intervention in order to meet individual students' learning needs. DBI has been shown to result in significant improvements to academic performance for students with learning disabilities. And we know that the more teachers use data in really systematic, meaningful ways to guide their instruction, the greater increases we see in students' academic performance. There is a whole process of DBI. There are many resources on the NCI website where you can get in-depth information about each of these different steps in the process. But most importantly, we're always beginning with the implementation of a validated intervention. So making a good choice about an evidence-based instructional program that works for students who have the types of learning needs that your students have. So we start with this validated intervention. And then as we begin the intervention, right away, we start collecting assessment data in a variety of ways to make sure we have the information we need to inform our ongoing instructional decisions. So there are many different decisions we make in intervention as teachers, working with students, but in this process of DBI, there's kind of two key decision points. The first is making a decision about whether to adjust instruction. So do we need to do something different to increase students' responsiveness to this instruction or to make sure the instruction better meets their needs? The second decision point is then if we say, yes, I need to adjust instruction, we need to decide how to adjust instruction. And so these two decision points are really aligned with two different sources of data. So these sources of data, in order to make a decision about whether to adjust instruction, we're going to use progress monitoring data, and we'll rely on those data to help us understand students' growth and whether I might need to do something different. Then we'll use diagnostic assessment data if we need more in-depth information about a student's learning profile in order to decide how to adjust instruction. So I'm briefly going to talk about these two data sources. The first, progress monitoring. Progress monitoring is simply the repeated measurement of student performance on a similar scale so that we can compare over time that helps us evaluate whether the intervention that we're delivering is producing desired growth or meaningful growth. Progress monitoring measures are sensitive to small change over time, so they allow us to understand if our intervention is doing what it's supposed to be doing, if it's really meeting students' needs. The most useful type of data to collect for progress monitoring are with general outcome measures. These are measures, most commonly general outcome measures we talk about, I have in bold here, curriculum-based measurement or CBM. These measures were developed by sampling performance on a broad skill and looking at students' overall reading proficiency. And so measuring this over time, using this measure repeatedly over time, helps us really understand how students are moving towards proficiency rather than just narrowing on one little skill that they might be learning incrementally. General outcome measures help us really understand kind of global learning and how all the skills that students are learning come together to help improve their performance. They let us compare students' growth over time and in different contexts that they're practicing and learning in. So in this case, we're talking about reading and we're talking about students who are in reading intervention. We most commonly recommend for progress monitoring using a measure that helps us understand this kind of global learning, looking at number of words read correct or CBM reading. In a lot of CBM systems, this is called ORF or oral reading fluency. And this is not fluency in of itself is not a skill that we're measuring, but it is really a proxy for overall reading achievement. We also know that ORF scores are strongly associated with standardized measures of reading and very much predictive of end of year standardized assessments that are given to students. We commonly represent progress monitoring data on a graph like this. This progress graph helps us look at how students are performing over time and understand how, by interpreting this graph, understand what kind of decisions we might need to make to meet students' needs. So the progress monitoring data we're collecting regularly helps us answer questions like, is the current intervention producing meaningful growth? Is the student's rate of growth sufficient to meet their individualized goals or needs? And is there a need to intensify or modify the intervention, or should I maintain the intervention as is, which is also an important decision. We don't want to change something if this intervention is working very well for the student. So if we've made a decision that we need to change something, we need to modify, we'll collect additional sources of data. This is where our diagnostic assessment data comes in. So we typically will administer these measures or collect this type of information if a student is demonstrating inadequate response to the intervention and I need to figure out where to go next, or if the student's learning profile is unclear and I need to dig deeper to understand their specific strengths and areas of growth. So this in-depth information looks at discrete academic skills. It can also give us information about behavior, motivation, attention, and a whole range of other factors that can influence students' learning. So these diagnostic assessment data help us answer slightly different questions. They help us generate hypotheses about students' learning needs. What do I think they need to help them start making growth? They also help us answer questions about how I should tailor my instruction or how I should intensify my instruction to help meet those needs for my students. So this is really where we're going to dig in with diagnostic assessment. I like to use an analogy of kind of like a zoom in, zoom out when we think of progress monitoring and diagnostic assessment. And I have a beautiful picture that I use generative AI to create for me. But the first is this kind of zoom out. If you think of this beautiful field of flowers, of having a whole view of what's happening in this field, are things growing? How does it look? And then if we want to know more, if we want to know the types of flowers that are in there, if we want to know what colors they are, how the soil's doing, are there weeds growing, we'll zoom in to get more detailed information. So both of these kind of perspectives give us important information, but different information depending on what kind of questions we're asking. So we go to our zoom in, that's where we're going to focus for the remainder of our time together. And thinking here that we're going to talk about is one type of diagnostic assessment called error analysis. You can conduct error analysis in a range of different content areas. There will be different NCI sessions talking about different content areas. But what we're going to talk about today is looking at students reading and doing an error analysis of the way they read and the words that they had difficulty with as they read. We're going to talk specifically about doing an error analysis with students' performance on CBM passages or ORF passages. These CBM data are reliable and valid, so they give us good information to start with. And then when we dive in and do this fine-grained error analysis, we get a really good sense of how I might change or intensify or modify my instruction. Error analysis helps us to figure out which words students have misread and not only which words, but what are the common features of the words that they're having difficulty with. And that helps us really figure out more about where I can tailor my instruction. Through this kind of diagnostic assessment, I'm able to really kind of dig into word features and notice what students are understanding or not understanding and prioritize my instruction. So I don't spend time teaching things that students seem to have or do really well with and have strengths in, and I can focus my instructional time on where students have gaps or need additional knowledge. So when we're conducting an error analysis specific to CBM ORF, I'm going to organize this into four big steps. And some of the steps are about kind of collecting the data to start off with, and then we move into kind of digging into the errors and understanding how students are performing. So the first step is to administer the ORF assessment. Obviously, we need to administer the assessment to have this as a starting point. So I'm going to talk briefly about this. And then if you need to know more, I'm going to share some resources as well where you can learn more about administration of CBM and ORF in future. So to start off to get going, you're going to need some materials. So you'll need an examiner script from whatever CBM system you're using. I'm going to show you an example of what this looks like in that one moment in the next slide. You'll need the student passage. So that's what the student has in front of them and they're reading. And then you'll also need a pen to mark what the student is reading, a timer because they're reading for exactly 1 minute. So we need to have that timed. And then it's recommended, and I like to use a clipboard to sort of have it close to me while students are reading. So these are sample CBM ORF probes from Dibble's 8th edition. These are commonly, I'm choosing Dibble's 8th edition because these are available on their website, which is noted at the bottom. And we have partnered with Dibble's before or with the Dibble's team before to use some of their materials to create training resources. But any CBM system you have that has CBM reading or ORF, it looks very similar to this in terms of having a passage that students read and then an examiner copy with the passage copied over and space for you to mark the errors that students have. So this is from a fourth grade progress monitoring passage called A Nest Made of Paper. If you want to know more, you can go look it up, read about the nest made of paper. When you get into the CBM administration, it has fairly simple procedures. These are procedures that should be followed very strictly, but they are fairly simple to implement. Before, you'll read the script, read the directions to the student so they know what's expected of them. And as soon as the student starts reading and says the first word, you start your timer. So they have exactly 1 minute that you're getting ready by pressing the timer as soon as they begin. While they're reading, you're going to listen to their responses. You're going to mark down all of the errors that they make. So if they say a word incorrect, you'll put a slash through the word that they read incorrect and sort of attend to like any rules you need to attend to during the administration. So if they get stuck, you can prompt them to move forward or provide them with a correction as necessary. At the end, so when the timer goes off at 60 seconds, you'll ask the student to stop and you'll mark the last word read when the timer went off at 60 seconds. So sometimes the students might read a few words after the timer goes off just to finish what they're saying, but you're going to mark on your page where the timer went off. So I'm going to show you a very brief video. I'm not going to show you the whole minute of the student reading, but I'm going to show you a brief kind of introduction to it with the directions being provided to the student and the way the student starts reading. There, I have a link below the video to a series of videos that we made from Project Expert, which was a project my team led. And we have a series of YouTube videos that have CBM ORF training videos. So we have different students reading CBM ORF passages, and then we have answer keys that go with them so people can practice administering these passages and this assessment and get good at it over time. So I'm going to give you a video, just a snippet to see what this might look like.
Please read this out loud. If you get stuck, I will tell you the word so you can keep reading. When I say stop, I may ask you to tell me about what you read, so do your best reading. Start here. Ready? Begin.
People aren't only the creatures
Creatures
that make paper wasps, yellow jackals, and ball-faced horns do too. In the spring, the inside cakewalk queen, who spend the winter hipper began, begins her nest. Paper wasps and ball-faced horns build their nests on tree branch. branch.
Branches.
Okay, so I'm going to stop there. At the end of 1 minute, the timer will go off, as I said, and then the student will finish reading. I'm going to answer one question that was in the chat while we're just staring at this pause video. When you're collecting progress monitoring data, how frequently do you want to collect data? If you're engaged, I would say regularly in intervention, we recommend collecting progress monitoring data weekly. If you're only able to collect it every second week during intervention, as frequently as you can. When you're using progress monitoring for the purpose of DBI, collecting it weekly is really important because it gives you ongoing regular information, and you need to have a series of data points in order to make a very informed decision about how students are progressing and what their growth looks like. So if you're only collecting progress monitoring data monthly, you're waiting to have enough data points to make a decision about whether or not this intervention is intensive enough for the student. You may be waiting 3, 4, 5 months before you can actually make that decision, which at that point, a lot of the school year has gone by before you can make a decision about intensifying the instruction. Um, and we can maybe have another session on progress monitoring another time. And there are also NCI resources too on progress monitoring. But there are a lot of different kind of logistical things to think about in terms of doing this well and smoothly and not taking too much of your instructional time when you're doing this in real life. Besides this recorded video we made with a student at the university. So you've been collecting these data, you're collecting these progress monitoring data, hopefully weekly, you're graphing it, you know how students are doing. Every time, I think I skipped one of my slides, did I? Oh no, okay, sorry. Every time you collect a CBM probe, you're going to have their score on that. And that score is what you're going to put on your progress monitoring graph to understand students' progress. So you'll identify all of their errors. As students read, you'll mark their errors just with a slash every time they make an error. If you're new to implementing this, you're not doing this regularly, it can be very helpful to record that 1 minute and then re-listen to it afterward so you can check your scoring. We sometimes forget how quickly students read, sometimes faster than we're able to kind of keep track on our page. So as you mark all the students' errors, it might look like this, where you're noting each time they said a word incorrectly. The long line that goes through that whole longer phrase is the student skipped part of the phrase. They skipped over to the next line. So then you'll look through and think about all the different types of errors. You'll know this before you start, but some of the kind of types of errors specifically to ORF are deviations from print. So there are 5 big kind of deviations from print that are counted as errors. The first is mispronunciation. So most commonly what you would think of when you think of an error with reading, the student says a similar word that isn't correct or a non-word. They try to get a close approximation. Instead of father, they read faster. Then the next would be a substitution. So the student replaces a word with another word. It could be a semantically similar word, could be a phonetically similar word, or just a word that they replaced it with. So they see front of car and they read it as front of the truck. The next would be reversal, so switching the word order. So they're reading the text, it says she said, and they read said she, and then they keep going. So you would mark that as an error, as one error. An omission is if the student skips over a word or a phrase or a line. And we saw in that sample where the student skipped over kind of almost a whole line and it was struck through on the page. And the example I have here is they're just skipping one word. Instead of reading the big dog ran fast, the student says the dog ran fast. And the next error is a hesitation. And this is the only time where you'll kind of jump in while they're reading. If they pause for 3 seconds and kind of get stuck on a word, 3 seconds or more, you will provide that word to them so that they can then keep moving forward with the text. And you will mark it as an error because you provided that word to them. There are other kinds of deviations from print that happen all the time while we read, and these three are deviations that are not counted as errors. So one is that for specifically for ORF, if a student inserts a word into the text, we don't count that as an error. So if the text says, um, I think I swapped my example here, sorry, in insertion. If the text says the green ball and the student says on the other side, the big green ball, that we would maybe make note of that so we know what's happening as students read, but that would not be counted as an error. The next is a repetition. So this commonly happens even when adults are reading. We'll kind of repeat a word to get the flow of how we're reading. So they'll repeat a word or repeat a phrase. So the student is reading and they say, it was floating up and away. So even though they repeated was floating twice, that's not counted as an error. And the last is a self-correction. So a self-correction is that I say the word incorrectly, but then I notice it independently and fix it myself. So I'm reading, I see the word blank, and I say black, and then I sort of pause and realize I said the wrong word, and I repeat again blank, and I say the correct word. So when we're doing administering ORF, we usually will write over the word SC, self-correct. You probably saw that on the previous page to sort of note that the student was making corrections here, but we're not counting these as errors. So the other thing that's important to note, I'm going to do this as a very quick note, but if students are mispronouncing words due to dialect or speech variation, that's not counted as an error. And if you are administering CBM passages with the student you work with, that you're in intervention with, you get to know them a lot more, the way they speak, kind of what their dialect is, what kind of variations to expect. And if you know they always pronounce a certain sound or a certain word, in a specific way, then you wouldn't count that as an error. That's just their typical speech, and they still read the word correctly. The other thing is that using different ORF tools, so these are very specific examples to Dibble's 8th edition. If you use other CBM systems that have ORF, they usually look very, very similar, but pay attention to slight kind of conventions that may vary. Some systems might use circles or underlines or slashes to count errors and just keep track of things. So we've been collecting oral reading fluency data regularly. We're marking the students' errors accurately. We're looking at their total scores. And now this is a calculation of their total score. So this student on the passage of the video that we read 75 words in that 1 minute. We're going to subtract from that the number of errors that they made from those 75 words. So 75 words, we're going to subtract the 25 errors that were made, and their score here is 50 words correct per minute. And so that score is their ORF score that we're going to use for progress monitoring each time we collect this probe, this measure. And this is the score we're going to put on our progress graph to understand students' growth over time. Now we get into that. Now we've done sort of the setup of how we're getting to the information we need to do an error analysis. So if we want to do an error analysis using our CBM ORFs that we've been collecting, we have our CBM ORF score. That's kind of our zoom out, the field of it's going back to the analogy I gave. In order to do the zoom in, there's one other thing you need to add to your administration, and that's that you actually have to mark specifically what the deviations from print were when the student was reading. So exactly what the student said, not just that they said the word incorrect. So you can decide if you're going to use these data for error analysis and you're collecting ORF data weekly, you may decide every second or third week you'll actually spend a little bit of extra time because as the student's reading, it does take that split second to write down what they said. does take some time and you're trying to keep up with them reading. So maybe every 2 or 3 times, you'll mark all of the exact errors, the things that they said as they read, so that you can go back and use this for error analysis. If you can do this every time they read, that's great. But like I said, it's hard to keep up. We kind of are, I'm always shocked how fast students read when we think that they're just going to be nice and slow for us to mark their errors as they go. So when we're going to use this for error analysis, we want to make sure we have at least one probe, a recent probe, that we have clearly marked. The student didn't say the word house, they said horse instead, and above, I'm going to put a slash and then write horse right above. So I remember exactly what they said. So if I take that same passage, a nest made of paper, the one I showed you before just had slashes every time the student made an error. If I want to use this for the purpose of error analysis, I'm going to have slashes for every word that was read incorrectly, but then I'm also going to write above the word that they said instead. So you can see where I wrote above what the word was. And I also put, for my own kind of memory and knowledge, I put little annotations to know if they said a short vowel, a long vowel, a schwa, kind of whatever deviated from print. And you can mark, if you're the one doing the error analysis, you can mark this up in whatever way makes sense to you. So the third step, now that I have my ORF administered, I have logged what the errors were, I've logged exactly what students said as they were reading. Now I'm going to categorize and analyze the errors. And I'm not going to be doing this every week. Keep in mind the two types of data and the reasons we're using these data sources. The reasons I'm doing an error analysis is because I need to generate hypotheses about students' learning and make some decisions about how to adjust instruction. So if students are making progress and I don't need to adjust instruction, I don't need to be collecting these fine-grained data regularly. This is helping me dig deeper when there is a need to dig deeper. So the way I'm going to analyze the errors, you can kind of create whatever table works for you. This is the sample that I use. I'm going to have the printed word, so what was in text, what the student should have read. I'm going to have the student's response, so what I wrote as the way that they pronounced the word or the way they said the word. And then I'm going to categorize their response in terms of the type of error that it is. And I'm going to talk about each of these as we go through, but I'm going to think, is this a phonemic error? Is it an orthographic error? Is it a morphemic error? Or is it an error with high frequency words? So what does that look like? Or what are these types of errors? I'm going to give you, from the examples I gave you before, I'm going to highlight the ones that specifically fall into each of these categories, each of these types, as we talk about what these types mean. So a phonemic error is when the student doesn't accurately represent all sounds or all the phonemes in the word that they're reading. So they're either leaving out a phoneme or they're having difficulty retrieving the correct phoneme that corresponds with the grapheme or the letter or letter pattern in the word. And so some examples here for this student, I highlighted them in orange, that the word in the text was spent and they read scent. So they left out one of the sounds, one of the phonemes as they were reading. The word was at the end, the word was pulp, and they said pup. So they left out that sound in the middle. So these are the phonemic errors I would notice. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why these errors happen as we read when we talk about instructional decisions. The next are orthographic errors. So orthographic errors are deviations that we make from what we would expect the grapheme to say. And so they're deviations from one-to-one grapheme, letter to phoneme, sound mappings, violations of common English rules, or syllable-based boundary errors for vowels and multisyllabic words. So saying a vowel as a long, short, or schwa when it is not the one that you decided to say. It is a different sound, a different vowel sound. So essentially, an orthographic error is that what I'm saying is not matching the graphemes that are being presented as within that word. So, for example, This, you kind of heard in the video, the student made a similar error to this with the word creatures. They weren't sure what to do with the E and the A together. So there could be a whole range of errors that happen here. In this example that I provided, the student sort of said creatures. So the way I just repeated it kind of sounded like the real word, but let's say the student really segmented a E, a, chers. Instead of roof, they said roof. Instead of chosen, they said chosen as they read that word. Instead of fibers, they said fibbers. Then we move into morphemic errors. So, morphemic errors are when the student doesn't accurately represent morphemes or meaningful word parts in the words that they're reading. And so, these are more common errors we see often in multisyllabic words because there are more morphemes in multisyllabic words. And the student may change a word part or a morpheme. They may drop a word part entirely, just skip over it, or they may mispronounce a prefix or a suffix that is in the word. So some examples here in purple, the word was bald-faced, and the student said face instead of faced. Instead of hibernating, they said hibernate, so they just dropped the suffix. And then instead of overhangs, they said overhang. So they're again dropping the suffix, the S at the end. I will say there is other kind of caveat here. Oftentimes, if the student is dropping the S at the end, you might want to kind of notice how they're reading other words that are plural. And is this a morphemic error or is it a phonemic error? Are they missing the sound? They're not kind of accurately or knowing how to represent that sound? Or is it really that they're leaving off a part of the end part of the word? You can even classify it as both while you're trying to understand more kind of how students are dealing with these words as they see them in text. And the last type of error in these four is high frequency word errors. So the student has difficulty reading a word that's either very commonly occurring. So, we see the all the time, we see was all the time, we see he, she all the time as we read. And those are words that we should be able to read automatically because they're so common in text. Or they're words that have irregular spellings, so they really need to become kind of high frequency words that we know how to see and say every time they appear in text. So some examples here with this student, they just made two errors. Instead of reading the word her, they said the instead. And at the bottom, instead of saying six, they said sixth. And so six should be a high frequency word. Students usually learn this. Would be a fourth grader in this text. So students usually would learn the word six, the numerals, kind of the words for numerals early on in their reading development. So I would mark these two as high frequency errors. So now I'm going to look at all of the errors I've marked. I have clear annotations of what the student says, and I'm going to put these together to give me a sense of what kind of patterns I'm seeing. So I'm going back to my table that I had blank before. I'm writing the word that was in the text, what the student said instead of pronouncing that when they mispronounced that word or when they didn't say it correctly, and then what category I'm going to put that word in, that error in. From this, it may be the example we see here is a little kind of, there are lots of different types of errors on purpose because I was making sure I had all the types of errors. But sometimes you'll see with a certain student, it is really one type of error that's standing out as very common for them, or two types of errors that are standing out as very common. And when you see this pattern, it gives you a suggestion of where you might go next instructionally. And so that brings us to step number 4, which is informing our instructional adjustments. So how do I use my analysis of students' errors to decide where to go next instructionally? So, for each of these error types, I'm going to give kind of a quick comment about why these types of errors might happen. So, to help as we're thinking about where to go instructionally, it helps to know why a student might make an error like this. And then a couple of kind of ideas of how to support students in building the skills they need to not make these types of errors. So phonemic errors tend to be pretty common in early readers. So if you imagine as you're learning grapheme phoneme correspondences, as you're learning early decoding, it is more common to not represent each sound that you see when text is presented to you. As students move into kind of second grade and beyond, phonemic errors become more rare, so you don't see them as frequently. But for students with reading difficulties, for students with a reading disability, especially at the word level, these errors will still you'll still see them come up. This is kind of it's telling us instructionally that a student has underdeveloped phonemic awareness. They're not either they don't have an understanding that every grapheme is going to be represented with a sound. They're not accurately hearing those sounds, or they have incomplete knowledge of grapheme phoneme correspondences. So they need more instruction kind of with letters and letter teams and what sounds to expect when they see those appear in words. How we would strengthen if students are making a lot of phonemic errors. If they're coming up once or twice, this is probably not where you want to place your instruction going forward. But if there's a pattern that they're coming up, we want to target some instruction there. So we want to strengthen students' phonemic awareness, focusing specifically on blending and segmenting to help support and transfer to decoding, to make sure that they have received or are receiving systematic phonics instruction with explicit teaching of grapheme phoneme correspondences, and that they have lots of opportunities to read the grapheme phoneme correspondences that they're being taught, both in isolated words and connected text. So if I'm learning, if I'm learning, I see the letter S and it says S, I'm going to read many words with S, the letter S in it. And then I'm also going to read connected text that has a lot of words with the letter S in it so that I can practice reading this regularly and then generalizing to outside of words to connected text. So I kind of gave like one more in-depth instructional example slide for each error type. But for this area where you might go next, you might integrate a blending routine. So the students would push a chip or an icon or a token into an Elkonin box, so a sound box for each sound that they hear. So we would hear the word and we would say, "K," move it up, move it up, move it up into the sound box, p, move it up. And then we would model with the student how to blend those sounds slowly. We would do that chorally to support them, and then the students would work on it individually. So we would say k, p, clap. And the students would then practice this with a variety of different words, with new sounds, more complex patterns as they go. And so the other thing we can do from that when we're working with the sound box is also practice kind of word chains. So students are understanding that if one of those sounds that they just represented in these boxes changes or move or leaves, then we're going to have a different word. So we might start with the sounds to make k, ap, cap, and then we're going to add an ul and have clap. And then we're going to change the to a I and have clip. And so we're working on really getting students attuned to each of the individual sounds that they're hearing in words. And if they're making a lot of phonemic errors while reading, this is likely the case that they are not hearing all of the individual sounds. The next is orthographic errors. And so these orthographic errors surface a lot. They're very common as students are becoming more proficient in reading. And they're also very common for students who have difficulty with reading. They're common because we are trying to grasp all of the complexities of our orthography, of the English language orthography. We're trying to understand spelling rules. We're trying to understand variations, so how different vowel sounds can be represented in different ways. And so as these patterns appear in words, we often make errors because we're not sure which vowel sound to choose to go with that pattern because there are different options. And so when students are making a lot of orthographic errors or when there's a commonality in their errors that they're all in this type, there's likely some gaps in their knowledge around English spelling rules, complex grapheme phoneme correspondence relations. So as we move into more complex patterns, difficulty recognizing vowel teams. So the example of the word creatures, the student didn't recognize the EA together as a team. They were trying to say each of those letters as a single vowel sound or recognition of syllable boundaries. And so when we move into, especially with multisyllabic words, the way that we're breaking syllables in that word will change whether or not we pronounce the vowel as a short or a long sound. And so if we don't have this understanding of how a word naturally breaks into syllables as we speak it, it gives us less information to inform what vowel sound we will use as we read that word. So, how can we support students in building their knowledge in this area? We want to explicitly teach high utility vowel patterns. So, we want to explicitly have taught students already EA. And when they see EA, they recognize the different sounds that EA can make within a word. We want to practice those patterns both in isolation, so a lot of words where those appear, but always, always moving into connected text. To generalize and make sure students are generalizing their knowledge from the individual GPC to the word to the text. And we also want to support students in building syllable awareness to inform the way that they pronounce words over time. And this syllable awareness becomes important. And this doesn't mean they have to learn every syllable type over time in great depth, but this real clear understanding of how words break up into syllables as we read them and speak them. So a quick example of an instructional target here to teach a high utility vowel pattern. I just gave for this sort of a sample script of explaining a vowel pattern. So you might say to a student, let's talk about vowel teams. A vowel team is when two or more vowels work together to make a single sound. And hopefully we've learned other vowel teams before that you can refer to. One example is the vowel team EA. When you say see EA in a word, it often makes the E sound, like in the word beach. Let's say the word beach together slowly. B-E-ch, beach. Great. Did you hear the long E sound? Perfect. Great. We're going to move to the next now. Let's look at some more examples where EA makes the E sound. Listen as I read them. Leaf, mean, team. Can you hear the E sound in each word? Then we'd say them together. And then you would go on, you'd say, I'm going to share a word. You're going to read it out loud and see if the EA vowel team makes the E sound. Ready? So we're going to practice with lots of words where we know EA is saying E. Once we have learned this, then we can introduce students to when EA appears and it's making a different sound. So we can say, we're going to talk about when EA makes the A sound, like in the word steak, or EA makes the sound, like in the word read, like I read a book. So we'll move on, teach that very explicitly so students have an understanding that every time they see EA, it isn't just a guess of what it could say. There are a number of different things that team could say, but I know what the options are, and I can try out each of those options to pronounce the word correctly. Another kind of example here is using a syllabication routine to support students' understanding of English orthography. So this is a really simple kind of syllabication routine of teaching the echelon strategy, or that every syllable has a L. Why am I blanking on the L for some reason? Someone can tell me in the chat. Every syllable has a vowel. I don't know why I'm blanking on the L in this moment. It's been a long day already. But first, we're going to review with the students alternate vowel sounds, short, long, and schwa. I'm sorry for the dog barking if you can hear that. We're going to teach students the echelon strategy so that they understand as we break a word into syllables. Thank you for someone in the chat. Every syllable has at least one vowel. Thank you. I don't know where the L went. So we're going to break the word into syllables. We're going to teach the echelon strategy. We're going to then practice it. And we're also, an important part of this is teaching mispronunciation prompts. So the echelon strategy, we're going to look at that big word. We're going to underline the vowels. We're going to circle the affixes, the prefixes, suffixes that we know, because that knowledge will help us read that word. We're going to count the syllables. So I see here 1, 2, 3 syllables because I underlined 1, 2, 3 vowels. And then we're going to break the word into those syllables to help us read together. As students read this word, we're going to give them these mispronunciation prompts so that they can see if they say the vowel and then need to flex it to get to the right word, how we do that. So a student sees a word and they say glorious, and then we'll say glorious, make it a real word. And you could say flex it, make it a real word. And they'll try a different vowel sound to get to glorious. The student will say energetic, flex it, energetic. And so when we're prompting them to say, make it a real word, flex it, what we're doing is prompting them to use an alternate vowel sound. And we're teaching them explicitly what we mean when we say flex it, that they're going to try a different vowel sound to get to a real pronunciation of the word. The next is morphemic errors. So that why these happen, morphemic errors happen with increased frequency as students are reading more multisyllabic words. So as they move into upper elementary grades, words become more complex, and students are often not sure how to handle those words. Students with reading difficulties tend to leave out a lot of word parts in multisyllabic words. They just skip over a piece of that word as they're going through. Students might make these errors because their phonics instruction hasn't advanced beyond single syllable words. So it hasn't moved to help them become more flexible with the way we deal with our written orthography. They may have underdeveloped phonological awareness, which is common for students who struggle or have difficulties with reading. And this may happen because the pronunciation of morphemes can vary across different words. So sometimes a word part in one word is pronounced a certain way. And then when we either add another morpheme or it appears in a different word, the pronunciation gets a little bit different, even though the stays the same. So obviously that can lead to us mispronouncing or making errors. Then we move into how to support. So we want to explicitly teach prefixes and suffixes. We want to show how the pronunciation shifts across related words. And a couple of examples. I'm going to try to start wrapping it up so we can share resources. A couple of examples here would be to use a very simple morphology routine. So this is a good morphology routine that has practice embedded in it, where we would teach high frequency affixes, we would name it, define it, provide sample words where I hear that prefix or hear that suffix, and the students would engage in practice with peel off reading. So I see a word, I peel off the affixes that I see in that word because if I can peel off parts that I know, that helps, that gives me information about how to read the word. And then I put the word together to read it in isolation. We can also then extend that to take our prefixes and suffixes and build words. So to do word building activities, the image at the side here has an example where I would have a base word with an affix. So I would have unable, and then I'd move it down, the un down, unlock, untie, unfair, and I'd keep going. And then you can mix that up in different ways. You can have suffixes. In the second image, there's a base word that we're moving down in the middle with different prefixes and suffixes. And so we would move it down and students would read the words and we would talk about whether that's a real word when they blend it together, and connect that to other information we know about those words. And the last is high frequency words. So, high frequency words, as I mentioned before, these are words that appear in nearly all texts. So, we want to become very automatic with the way we read these words. We don't want any effort to have to be made when we see these words in print. High frequency words generally can have irregular spellings. And so, for a student who struggles with reading or who is new to learning how to decode, this can throw us off as readers because there aren't predictable grapheme phoneme correspondences like I've been practicing. And it could be that students have not had enough repeated exposure to build automatic recognition of these high frequency words. So, how to support is to build recognition with repeated practice, ensuring that students get corrective feedback as they're doing this repeated practice. This is not 15 minutes, 20 minutes of flashcards with sight words. This is very quick practice that is cumulative over time, is distributed over time. Students are regularly coming back to these words. We want to make sure that they're able to read them correctly and say them correctly. So when you're introducing sight words or high frequency words, you can use incremental rehearsal which is very kind of strategic approach to introducing a word on a flashcard or an index card, and the student practices reading it. You give corrective feedback as necessary, and then we incorporate those new cards, the new ones we're working on, with the old ones we learned, and we keep practicing to mastery. So, I went quick at the end to share a couple of things, and I'm going to turn it back over to Zach in a moment. A couple of resources here. On the left side of the screen, I have a screenshot of an article that I wrote with some colleagues that was in a special issue of Intervention in School and Clinic. It is an article specifically on reading error analysis and goes through these four steps in more detail. So, everything I sort of talked about in quick snapshots is described in much more detail. It is open access, so you can go to this tiny URL. I'll put it in the chat as well in a moment, but you can go to this tiny URL and download the article for free. In the middle is just a screenshot from some of the training videos that we've created. So that's our YouTube channel. The YouTube address is at project_expert. There are a variety of training videos. So if you are new to administering CBM or let's say you have a student teacher or someone new in your classroom who's going to help you out, they can practice kind of learning how to listen to a student read and score as they watch these training videos. And like I said, there's an answer key for each one as well, so then they can check to see how they did. And we have some other videos up there too, like how to administer CBM or why progress monitoring, different information about kind of DBI related resources. And then the last on the right, I'll turn it over to Zach right now because this is the resource he's going to mention, is a resource that NCII put together on error analysis.
Thanks so much, Dr. Toss. I will just briefly say that we developed a resource on error analysis in word reading and spelling. And so it mirrors much of what you heard today. It really pulls from the article that Dr. Toss just shared, but it also gets into some error analysis in spelling, which is a related strategy. And we use the same error categories that Dr. Toss shared. And so I just have a couple screenshots on the next slides.
This one or
We can go back one. This one is just an example. We show the different error types, we describe them, give examples of each. So this is an example for orthographic errors. Then on the next slide, we also have a sample error analysis like Dr. Toss demonstrated. We have a table that's similar, but a little different to what Dr. Toss shared in terms of the printed word, the student response. We have a column for kind of the teacher analysis in terms of what caused the error, and then the error type. And then finally, I think we also just have some additional resources to support each of the error types. So please, check out our resource on this. We also have some upcoming error analysis webinars if you're interested. We have error analysis in math with Dr. Sarah Powell and Allison Hardy. That's June 3rd at 3 p.m. Eastern. And then error analysis in writing with Dr. Katie Valentine. And that's getting beyond just the word level spelling and into sentence and text level errors as well. And I think we have a few minutes to take a couple questions. I think there's a few in the Q&A.
Yeah, if I can answer one question
Yeah.
I saw in the chat, I saw it when I was a few slides past, so I didn't want to stop and go back. But someone had asked if a student skips a whole line when you're administering ORF, how you count that in terms of errors. So in most systems, this is true, but I will say, and specifically in Dibble's 8th edition, if they skip a line, you count each omitted word as an error. So like if they skip over 3 words, that's 3 errors. If they skip over a whole line, that's 7 words, it's 7 errors.
Great, thank you. It looks like there was one additional one in the Q&A pod about, I don't know if you know this off the top of your head, but what does the research show about CBMs being given digitally versus paper or pencil?
I think there are people have different opinions on it. I think we are starting to gather more kind of evidence about different kinds of administration, and if there's any change kind of to performance or reliability when we're administering these things electronically. I will say that for the purpose of DB, like you administer similar to CBM or when we're doing universal screening with all of your students in a school. So obviously there's a real benefit to being able to do it electronically because so many students are taking that assessment. For the purpose of DBI, when I'm in intervention, I personally really like doing this paper and pencil where I am listening to the student read, especially if you want to use this to inform your understanding of the student's strengths and areas where they're having difficulty. You are getting so much information from listening to them read and noting their errors and really kind of being the one to sit there and collect that. And it is a very quick probe that gives you so much information. So I will say there over the I imagine over the next couple of years we will get a lot more evidence coming out though about different types of administration.
Thank you. And I see one, maybe we have time for this last one. It says, with beginning readers, would you ever do an untimed CBM to see if their benchmark score is fluency based or accuracy based? I'm not not totally sure how to interpret
Um,
it, but
yeah, I think I know what you're asking. I would not use their score in any so yeah, you could do this just to kind of if you want to get a sense of the types of errors they're making or like how much they can read in 1 minute to get a sense of it, even if you're not timing it. I probably wouldn't use their score if you're not administering it per the directions and using only 1 minute, because the norms that you see really are about when you look at like the norms in terms of number of errors expected, that is based on students being stopped at 1 minute. And so there is you can't it's hard to take apart kind of the number of errors you would expect to see and that kind of overall fluency score we're calculating because in the benchmarks that is really related to them only having 1 minute to read. But I think you can do, if you're doing this sort of qualitatively to get a sense of how a first grader is going to deal with this text and approach this text and what kind of words they're having trouble with, you could certainly use like a first grade progress monitoring probe as a way to sort of start gathering that information.
okay. Well, thanks so much again, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We're out of time. We really appreciate you being here, and we
Yeah.
will please please join our future events as well if you're interested in error analysis in these other areas. Thanks, everyone.